It is now 2025, which means not only is NightReign just around the corner, but it also marks the 3rd birthday of Elden Ring itself. So to celebrate and get you guys back into the Elden Ring mood to prepare for NightReign, I thought I would go through 15 different builds with you guys that I think are some of the most fun and powerful builds that you can still use to this date. And yes, in this video I will be showing you the full builds with the talismans and stats and everything to go with it. So definitely sit back, relax, enjoy this one, and be sure to let me know in the comments what your favorite build is out of the entire list. But talking of said list, we might as well get it started, and this is going to be in no means any particular order. These are just 15 builds I think are really incredible, but the first build that I want to talk about, so I guess coming in at the number 15 spot, is going to be our Fire Lord build. Now you have probably seen this build before, and you can probably hazard a guess that it revolves around all of the fire weapons in the game, but actually the last time we visited this build, the DLC was not out yet, so with really cool additions like the Fire Knight's Greatsword, along with all of Mesmer's incantations, the Fire Lord build did get a bit of an upgrade, because when you add those DLC items to already existing weapons like the Magma Blade, Burn O Flame, and even incantations like Flame of the Fell God, you can create a really versatile and really powerful fire build, which is good against pretty much everybody. You guys know how much I'm a fan of the Magma Blades. They are just probably one of the best weapons in the entire game. I mean, they're a curse sword, and if you get 2 of them, you can use one of the most broken movesets, and the Ash of War does immense damage as well as a good amount of poise damage, but even the combination of the Fire Knight's Greatsword with Flame Spear is also just an absolute monster. So combining the two was pretty much a no-brainer, and in order to do that, here are the stats and talismans that I was using. And again, with all of these builds, they're going to be a level 150 build, and so I don't repeat myself 15 times, every single build is going to be using Golden Vowel and Howler Shabiri as a buff. But using things like Godfrey's Icon, that works with things like Flame Spear specifically, as well as some of the incantations we're using too. But the Shard of Alexander and the Talisman of Dread are also going to be handy for things like the Magma Blade, especially if you're using their skill powers. And then the Ritual Sword Talisman is there just to give us an additional buff in damage. I wasn't using any boosting armor, I was just running around with a Fire Monk's armor, so rather than make myself even more squishy with something like the Fire Scorpion Charm, I went with the Ritual Sword Talisman, but the Fire Scorpion Charm is of course a good replacement. Obviously you can see the stats there, we basically delved a little bit more into Faith just to get the best fire damage possible, whilst also giving us enough dexterity and strength to cover us for any other weapons we want to be using, as well as getting the best out of the Fire Knight Greatsword. But saying that, in the Physic, we've also got the Faith Knot tier and the Flame Crack tier to again boost our fire damage as much as possible, because essentially everything we're using is of course using fire, so that's a no-brainer. This build is extremely versatile, extremely fun to use, and I highly recommend that if you haven't even tried any fire incantations, even some of the most mediocre ones can be extremely powerful with this kind of build, so definitely give it a go. But if that build isn't quite stylish enough for you, the one that we've got in the number 14 spot might just hit the mark, because at number 14 we've got a build I'm calling Bloody Finesse. And yes, it is revolving around the Obsidian Lamina as well as the Bloody Hellis, hence the name. And with both of those weapons, they've got unique movements with their skill power being like finesse movements or the sickle play movements, which will evade pretty much any attack if you get the timing right. But then if you also follow up with a heavy attack, depending on the weapon you're using, you will then have a unique either thrusting or slashing move that you can then hit your enemies with, which will deal a nice amount of damage and stagger humanoid enemies like Melania, meaning that you can just style on her and she rarely can reply. Where this build does fit both weapons, I personally enjoyed using the Bloody Hellis a little bit more, just simply because it's got a better arcane scaling and therefore can deal more bleed damage, because yes, both of these weapons do have innate bleed build-up, and that's also probably going to be your best bet if you're entering the DLC, especially coming up against like the final boss in the DLC. And if you want to make the most of this build, here again are the stats and the talismans. So I was actually using both Millicent's Prosthesis and the Rotten Winged Insignia, because you can still proc them with the normal attacks of these weapons. Again, the Obsidian Lamina has a nice unique charged heavy attack where it'll do a couple of swings, so if you attack your enemies a couple of times before using the Ash of War, you can deal quite a substantial amount of damage. And and where both weapons do have an innate bleed build-up, we do focus on arcane and dexterity. Obviously, the faulty dexterity is there because we get a +5 from the Millicent's prosthesis, so it's split between the two. But then we also improve our dexterity even further with the dexterity not tier, and I also threw in the spiked cracked tier because, like I said, specifically with the Obsidian Lamina, it does have a unique charged heavy, which does hit the enemy twice, so it is nice just to get the extra +15% if you are going to be doing that along with the Ash of War, because if you are going to do that, you're going to break your enemy stances really quickly, because both of those attacks deal a tremendous amount of stance damage, which again is another reason why you should be using this build. But of course, we've still got many more builds to go through, and the next one that I want to talk about is the one coming in at the number 13 spot, and that is going to be Holy Knight 2.0. So yes, very similar to the Fire Lord, we have made a few changes to a previous build I called the Holy Knight, because again, with the DLC, we got one weapon in particular, being the Euphoria, that I wanted to add to the Holy Knight build, because for those of you that don't know, the Holy Knight was revolved around things like Ordovis's Greatsword, Siluria's Tree, as well as things like the Halo Scythe to not only deal tremendous amounts of damage, but also break enemy stances at will, all whilst having insane range options. With the inclusion of the Euphoria, we can also switch up that gameplay and go a bit more fast-paced, and the Euphoria is easily one of the best weapons in the game, especially when you fully charge it up, giving yourself an extra 100 odd holy points to the weapon just by simply attacking your enemies. So this build is not only one of the most damaging ones out there, but it's definitely the most versatile, and with the stats and everything that I'm now going to throw up on screen for you, you can very easily see that you will have access to every single incantation. So if you're a little bit more adventurous than me and actually want to go and use some of the cool incantations in the game, you can do, because we've got 70 faith in the build, and with the talismans I've got them set up mainly for the Euphoria, but if you want to swap out Millicent's prosthesis and the Rotten Winged insignia for things like Godfrey's icon to help with the Ordovis's Greatsword and Siluria's Tree specifically, feel free to do that. But in the Wonder Physic, I highly recommend that you keep it with the Faith Not tier and the Holy Crack tier. That will also boost any damage you're going to be doing with any of these weapons. And I can't lie, Holy Knight 2.0 probably is one of the better builds in this list. It's certainly one of my go-tos whenever I just want to like destroy a certain boss, which is of course why it's a part of this list. And moving on with the list, at the number 12 spot, we have got Sekiro 2. So yes, this is a build revolving completely around a deflecting hard tier, but to keep with the Sekiro theme, I thought we would use katanas like the Nagakiba, because when you have the deflecting hard tier on, if you perfectly time your guards, so pressing LB or I believe L1 on PlayStation, you will not take any damage, and every time that you perform a perfect block up to 4 times, you'll be boosting the damage that you deal as well as the stance damage you deal with a guard counter. This can be extremely deadly, just not in my hands. As some of the gameplay is probably going to be showing you right now, I am poor at timing. I don't parry in the game, and this is why, because I'm rubbish at it. But even with me fumbling literally every attack from every enemy, I was still able to pull some of them off and obviously get a good hit in here or there. And even in the later New Game Pluses, I was breaking enemies' poises in just 2 or 3 hits. So basically guard a couple of hits, hit them with the guard counter, and then rinse and repeat that 2 or 3 times, and they had their stance broken. So if you're a fan of Sekiro and basically want to try and challenge yourself in Elden Ring to play like Sekiro, this is definitely the build for that. And again, here are all the stats for everything that we're using, because I was using a Nagakiba with both the double / Ash of War on it, and of course using things like Bloodflame Blade, so hence the stats that you're seeing on screen. But realistically, the Great Shield Talisman will be the best thing for you, because if you're like me and you struggle a little bit, even if you mistime the block and you're a little bit early, you won't have as much stamina taken off of you, so you can kind of keep trying and keep repeating it. But then once you become a master, you can probably swap that out for something else, maybe something like a Ritual Swords Talisman, because like I say, if you perfectly guard, you're not going to be taking any damage, so you'll always be at full HP if you just get every attack perfectly timed. But of course, the Dexterity Not tier is in there to help with the Nagakiba's stats, and obviously the Deflecting Hard tier is in there as well, because that's what makes this build work. So if you want a little bit of a fun challenge, maybe see if you can get to the Deflecting Hard tier in your first playthrough and go through New Game Plus 1 or a later New Game Plus using specifically the Deflecting Hard tier, and try and beat Elden Ring in Sekiro mode. And as much as that build is brilliant at breaking enemy stances, this next build takes it to a whole new level, because at number 11, I've got the Stance Breaker build, which is fully around the Blood Fiend's arm. Now, I'm not going to really waste too much time with this build because I've spoken about this weapon and this kind of build more than enough, but essentially the DLC weapon, the Blood Fiend's arm, is an insane colossal weapon which has over 50 stance damage if you hit your enemies with a fully charged heavy attack, which of course you can buff with things like the Stone Barb Crag tier. That means you'll be doing 120 plus stance damage every 2 charged heavies, which in base game is enough to stance break pretty much everybody with those 2 hits. But if you also add Cragblade into the mix, that will have you covered again for everybody. Even in New Game Plus 7, nobody is safe, because if you also turn this weapon into a blood variant, you're also doing over 200 bleed damage, which also will proc pretty much every single or every other attack. So basically, if you're not breaking your enemy stances, you're definitely breaking their health bars, and whereas a colossal weapon, it also just naturally does a huge amount of damage anyway. So to copy this insane build, here is everything that you need for it. Of course, things like the Axe Talisman are going to go a long way, and as I mentioned, we've got the Stone Barb Crag tier in there, as well as the Spiked Crag tier, again to help with the Axe Talisman, but we're also going to be up close and personal. You might trade against the faster enemies, so that's why the Dragon Crest Great Shield is in there, and then if you feel like it's probably going to be more beneficial for you, you can take out the Ritual Swords Talisman and put one of the Green Turtle Talismans in to help with stamina regen, because the Blood Fiend's arm, or just colossal weapons in general, do take up a lot of your stamina when you're doing a charged heavy. But also, like I said, we made this weapon a bleed variant, so make sure that you apply bleed to this weapon. Again, use an Ash of War like Cragblade and pump most of your stats into Arcane like I've done here, and you will be on for a winner. And even though it is a bleed weapon, this weapon will still destroy non-bleed enemies, so people like Radagon and the Elden Beast, just simply because you're going to be breaking their stances and just making their fights an absolute doddle. So as much as the previous build with Sekiro was kind of like turning on hard mode, if you want to turn on super easy mode, run this build. And with that said, we're now moving on to the build in the number 10 spot, and this is going to be a build that I'm calling the Karate Kid. This build, of course, basically revolves around the Dry Leaf Arts or Dane's Footwork. Again, it doesn't matter which one you want to use because they both do the same damage, just one is going to prioritize kicking and the other is going to prioritize punching. But whichever one you choose, you're going to have a fast, free-flowing moveset, obviously with your fists and your feet, which can again annihilate most bosses just on their own, but the charged heavies do deal a substantial amount of stance damage too, and also if you use the jumping heavy attacks, that too can deal a nice amount of stance damage, and you get multiple hits in. Not only are you doing tremendous damage whilst running this build, you also look like a complete badass as you're just beating everybody up with your kung fu moves, and the best part is both of those weapons can be infusible. So whereas in the later New Game Pluses for this particular footage, I relied on bleed to get me through some fights, so I did delve into a little bit of a bleed route, but other people do tend to also use things like poison and also cold affinities on these bad boys, because again, they're just as good, and both Dane's Footwork and also the Dry Leaf Arts are a quality type weapon, having a split scaling in both strength and dexterity. So here's how you can get the best damage out of that. So obviously, as you can see, again, we're using a very heavy DPS based talisman system, and of course using things like the Lords of Blood's Exaltation in there, just because I focused on the bleed aspect. But if you wanted to, you can swap that out for things like Godfrey's Icon, where you will also be getting an additional buff for your Ash of War Palm Blast, which also gives you hyper armor and deals an insane amount of damage for what it is, whilst also doing a high amount of stance damage. So yeah, if you didn't want to rely on certain status effects, you can just naturally use the weapons and still do a lot of damage itself. As I say, splitting strength and dexterity is going to be your best bet. So with Millicent's Prosthesis, as well as the dexterity knot tier in here, we're pumping that up to around about 55. But again, mainly we're getting the best damage output from DPS. So Millicent's Prosthesis, the Rotten Winged Insignia, and also the Thorny Crag tier are going to boost our damage output significantly. And actually continuing the theme of DPS and just significant amounts of damage, the build that I've also got in the number 9 spot is the return of Elemental Fury. This is again another build that I've covered in the past, because it's actually one that I feel deserves a little bit more love. It is around the Venomous Fangs, but it's around getting 2 Venomous Fangs so that you can also apply bleed and cold affinities to each one, so that you're running a build that is is not only poisoning your enemies, but it's also causing bleed effects on them, and it's also freezing them. Having all three of those elements going on at the same time can result in some really high damage numbers, and whether Venomous Fangs are a fist weapon, they are extremely quick, just like obviously Dane's footwork that we just talked about, meaning that all of these procs are going to happen more or less instantaneously. And of course, once you've frozen your enemies, they will then be taking an additional 20% extra damage from any attack that you hit them with afterwards. So again, if you apply Ash of the Wars like Crackblade to the Venomous Fang, you can easily be doing thousands of damage just with one single punch. Again, I'm not really going to waste too much time because I want you guys to use this build and go and try it for yourself. So here is everything that you need obviously to make that happen, and it is basically a borderline copy of the previous build in terms of its stats and talismans, just with swapping out the Shard of Alexander and also the Lord of Blood's Exaltation for the Dragon Crest Great Shield and the Ritual Sword talisman. Then we've also got some very similar stats whilst also running the same Wonder Physic combination. So realistically, you can use Elemental Fury and Karate Kid sort of like in the same kind of build, just obviously swap out the relevant talismans. But like I say, I wanted to feature this particular build and more shout out the Venomous Fangs again, because it may not be a weapon that everybody thinks about when they think of overpowered weapons, but as you're seeing with the damage numbers, these can be extremely deadly. In fact, their damage numbers are up there as one of the highest, and again, if you're a much more skilled player than me, you're also going to get more hits in, which means more procs, which means even higher damage numbers. So definitely use these weapons and use this build, because I can guarantee you, you're not going to want to put it down. But as much as I can talk about that build all day long, we're only just halfway through this list, because coming in at the number 8 spot is going to be a build that I'm calling the Hand Cannon. Again, it's using a weapon that maybe not everybody is going to choose outright because it's just simply a dagger, but when you come to realize that the Glintstone Chris has a ridiculously powerful Glintstone Dart attack with a really good piercing follow-up, you can deal an immense amount of damage from a really far range to then quickly be at your enemy's tippy toes, dealing even more damage whilst also potentially dodging some incoming attacks too. You can also just spam the absolute hell out of this Ash of War if you really want to, so similar to that of just spamming the Glintstone Dart spell, but it uses very little FP, can also deal even more damage compared to the spell itself, and because this is an intelligence based weapon, an intelligence based attack, you can also pair this with other spells like the Night spells and Rani's Dark Moon to increase the power and versatility even more. Again, here are the stats and the talismans and everything that you need for this, and it's pretty much a standard intelligence build, just heavily focused around more mind and more intelligence, whilst giving us the greatest buffs possible for the Glintstone Dart Ash of War. And we are going to be a little bit more squishy with this build because I was running the Magic Scorpion Charm, but if you want to swap that out for something a little bit more defensive, because as you can see, I was using Celavus' set, which basically gives me hardly any armor ratings at all, feel free to swap out the Magic Scorpion Charm for something like the Dragon Crest Great Shield, or possibly even the Graven Mass Talisman, just again help on the spell side, but feel free to run a much heavier armor. I was just using Celavus' for the looks, but as I mentioned, we pump pretty much everything we can into intelligence whilst increasing our mind quite significantly, whilst also running the Intelligence Knot tier and the Magic Shroud and Crack tier to again boost all magic damage and make this build an absolute monster. And whilst we're on sort of like the Glintstone and Carrion theme, the build that I've got in the number 7 spot is going to be Rolana's Revenge. As the name suggests, we're basically going to be copying Rolana's build using her insane twin blades, but we can also make use of the Sword of Night and Flame. That is actually going to be the more damning weapon with this build, just because it does a lot more damage compared to Rolana's Twin Blades. So if you are looking just to deal as much damage as possible, the Sword of Night and Flame is the way to go. But if you want much more style points and possibly have a lot more fun with this build, Rolana's Twin Blades is definitely the way to go, as they have a much more free-flowing moveset, with this weapon being one of the brand new ones in the DLC, as it's a light greatsword, but it also copies her moves and damage output, with one weapon dealing additional magic damage and the other weapon dealing additional fire damage. So these can be extremely good against anybody who's obviously weak to magic or fire, and you can of course make use of Rolana's Vortex and also her Transient Moonlight when using the Ash of War, because both Rolana's Twin Blades and the Sword of Night and Flame are a stance-based move, so if you hold the move for a little moment, you can make use of things like Rolana's cameo. And actually, just talking of that, here is the talismans and the stats and everything you need for the build. So as I say, Rolana's cameo is there, but so too is the Ritual Sword Talisman and the Shard of Alexander, and I actually leaned into the fire attacks for both weapons in this particular build. So I ran the Fire Scorpion Charm along with the Faith Physic and the Flame Shrouding Cracked Tier, but if you're more of a fan of the magic-based attacks with both the Sword of Night and Flame and also Rolana's Twin Blades, feel free to swap out the Fire Scorpion Charm with the Magic Scorpion Charm, and obviously swap out the Flame Cracked Tier with the Magic Cracked Tier, and you can basically interchange those buffs because we've split the intelligence and the faith, so we can make use of both attacks even without the respective buffs. But I am a fire merchant, like I just prefer seeing fiery vortex fly up on my screen dealing thousands of damage, hence why I lent into the fire side of things. And also the Sword of Night and Flame's fire attack is also probably one of the most broken ones, so again, it's ideal to lean into the fire side, but of course the magic side is just as good in certain scenarios. So again, take these stats, use the appropriate buffs that you want to use, and either way you're going to be destroying bosses. But another really fun build to destroy bosses is going to be the one at the number 6 spot, and that is going to be a build I'm calling Marked for Death. And yes, this is revolving around all of the Destined Death weapons and incantations, as well as applying a few Black Flame incantations in there as well, just to deal damage over time. But the stars of the show are definitely things like the Black Knife and Malekith's Black Blade, because with those Ashes of Wars, not only are you going to be doing thousands of damage, but you'll also tick away at your enemy's health, and if you use it for the first time in battle, you will also immediately take away 10% of your enemy's health bar, which will be grayed out, similar to that of like a bleed effect, giving you an instant advantage at the very beginning. Basically, the consensus with this is to start every boss fight with the Black Knife, so you can use the Black Blade skill power, but then you swap into Malekith's Black Blade to then hit your enemies round the head with a massive greatsword that again will be doing thousands of damage, whilst also doing a substantial amount of stance damage, just making the game an absolute breeze. The Ash of War on this weapon is also incredible, as it's got 3 different attacking moves. Basically, we're copying Malekith's attack where he swings the sword around, hitting your enemies first of all before then plunging the sword into the ground, which again can hit your enemies, to then finally unleash that flurry of attacks similar to that of like a waterfowl, but it's a Destined Death version, which altogether not only does thousands of damage, but like I say, will also be doing damage over time if you get that third flurry off, and you can just become an absolute nuisance to bosses with this setup, as you just obliterate them with pretty much anything. You've got range, you've got power, and you've definitely got style whilst doing this, and here's what you need to make this build happen. So again, where we're utilizing a lot of skill powers, the Shard of Alexander's in here, but we've also got the two-handed talisman for when we're using Malekith's Black Blade just with the regular attacks. But then I also went with the Dragon Crest Great Shield and Ritual Sword Talisman, mainly because Malekith's Black Blade skill power does take a little bit of time to pull off, so if you do end up trading, you've got the Dragon Crest Great Shield there, but again, if you're at full HP, you'll get a plus 10% to all the damage that you're doing. And then we just prioritize both Faith and Strength, again, to get the best out of Malekith's Black Blade specifically, but then we also increased our Faith with the Physic, as well as our Holy damage, because Destined Death is holy. This is not going to affect the Black Flame incantations that I mentioned, because they're fire based and you need fire damage for that, but the Faith Knot tier will of course affect them, but the Holy Shrouding Crack tier is specifically for Destined Death abilities. But either way, this build is super fun to use, is also super satisfying and really cool with its animations, and again, if you haven't tried any Destined Death builds, you're definitely missing out, so give this one a go. And now we are sort of like entering the final stages of this video, and although I said in the intro I wasn't actually like ranking any of these builds, it seems like I've subconsciously actually added all of the best builds till last. Like, I promise you, I'm going down the list now and I'm actually just seeing that pretty much every one of these last 5 builds are nuts. So to kick off the sort of like top 5, if you will, in the number 5 spot, I have put the Dark Knight here. This build is purely just around the Claws of Night, which are just an absolutely ridiculous weapon, because much like with fist weapons, claws are just as quick, if not they're actually a little bit quicker, but the Claws of Night have a unique ability with their charged heavy attacks and of course their Ash of War, where you actually throw those claws that you have at your enemies. This means that you've got added range to your attacks, so you can keep stance pressures going if your enemy decides to run away for whatever reason, and to be fair, I don't blame them if they do run, because if you can keep them up close and personal, you are just going to absolutely annihilate their health bars, because with the Claws of Night's innate bleed build-up and fast moveset, you'll be doing tens of thousands of damage very quickly. Again, I'm not really going to waste much time here because this is pretty much a repeat of some of the DPS builds that we've had before, but where these Claws of Night only scale off of dexterity, these are the stats and everything that we're going to be running. And again, where it's DPS based, we're using the usual talismans and utilizing the innate bleed build-up that these claws have as well. And although this is like the second or third DPS build in this video, it's still an immense amount of fun, as you can cosplay as one of the coolest knights in the DLC, being Yolan, and just wreak havoc as the Dark Knight. And the Claws of Night are definitely a weapon that I suggest you guys use, and like I said, I'm going to keep this one short and sweet. Try this build, you won't regret it. And you know how sometimes in this video so far we've had like themes like back to back? Yeah, at the number 4 spot, I've got a build that I'm calling the Shredder, which is basically exactly the same as the previous build, just using the Falx. I'm gonna really keep this one short and sweet because yeah, here's the stats. They're basically the same, but I think what I wanted to do is specifically shout out the Falx, because the Falx is even more ridiculous than the Claws. The real main difference between this build and the previous one is we're actually making use of the jump attacks and also the Ash of War, because those are going to be even higher when it comes to DPS, as the Ash of War is just outright ridiculous and has brilliant tracking and can stun lock NPCs and humanoid enemies like Melania, so you can literally rip through the game, hence the name Shredder. But like I say, because this is a curved sword, and when you two-hand this weapon, you actually get 2 of them rather than just two-handing one weapon, you can make easy use of the power stance curved sword attack, so jumping and pressing your light attack will release a flurry of attacks whilst you fly through the air. So basically, if you ever get bored of throwing needles or claws at your enemies, if you just swap the claws out for the Falx, you can basically then become the most deadly jumping jack as you destroy basically half of an enemy's health bar as you soar through the air. I'm sorry that I've basically just given you like 2 builds are borderline the same back to back. I believe I just wanted to shout out the 2 different weapons because they are both in their own right absolutely insane. So again, if you haven't used the Falx, definitely use it because it's up there as one of the best weapons in the entire game. And now that that's out of the way, I can introduce you to the build at the number 3 spot, which is going to be the Dragon Priestess. This build, as you can probably already tell, revolves completely around dragon incantations, or I should say dragon cult incantations. So things like the Knight's Lightning Spear and of course Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike, which can deal tremendous amounts of damage, so much so that Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike can pretty much one-shot any boss. Of course, you guys will probably already know the gimmick of Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike. It is basically RNG based, but it is ridiculously powerful and can actually deal a substantial amount of stance damage too. But this build revolves around the Dragon Priestess Heart. It is part of a DLC quest line revolving around Bale in the DLC, but once you get your hands on that, whenever you use it without any armor on, you will then become this Dragon Priestess, and then if you use the heart again, you will boost your Dragon Cult incantations for 1 minute, so applying that along with your usual buffs as well as these stats and talismans, that is how we are doing these sort of like one-shot kills, because of course we're getting buffs from the Phlox Canvas talisman as well as Godfrey's icon, because again these incantations are chargeable. But then we've got the Lightning Scorpion Charm and the Ritual Swords Talisman mixed with an unholy amount of faith, and of course the Lightning Shrouding Crack Tier. Mix this in with certain seals that also boost Dragon Cult incantations like the Gravel Stone Seal, and you're just on for a winner. If you ever get bored of one-shotting bosses with the Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike, like I say, you can use lesser spells or just rely on things like the new Knight's Lightning Spear, which again does tremendous amounts of damage and a tremendous amount of stance damage, but also has better tracking and better range, whilst also having the ability to knock enemies over. So as much as this is a glass cannon build, because obviously to go into this form we've got no armor, so having no armor as well as having a Scorpion Charm probably isn't the best thing to do. Enemies won't have a chance because you can either trade or just get your shots in first and it's good night. like, it's game over. So if you're ever bored and you want to try and see how many bosses you can one-shot with this build, definitely let me know in the comments how many bosses you one-shot and if you actually were able to one-shot everybody, because again, this build can be refined if you go into like the higher levels and do additional buffs like the Age 1's Exaltation, etc. So yeah, the sky is literally the limit with this type of build. And as much as I'm saying the sky's the limit with that kind of build, we are going to bring ourselves back down to earth a little bit here, because for the build at the number 2 spot, I have got the Iceman here. This is basically an intelligence version of the Holy Knight build that we talked about towards the very beginning, where we are going to be utilizing a whole different range of intelligence weapons, more specifically around those that deal additional ice damage. So yes, that includes things like the Clayman's Harpoon with the Ice Spear Ash of War on it, Darkmoon's Greatsword, and of course the Death's Poker. Each one of these weapons with their Ashes of Wars are just outright ridiculous, as the Darkmoon Greatsword and the Ice Spear can do a tremendous amount of stance damage whilst also causing high amounts of Frostbrock, but the Death's Poker is definitely the most broken one, because if you use its Ghost Flame Ignition and light attack the orb, you can set that trail of Ghost Flame, which just again does ridiculous damage numbers. Don't ask me how or why this works, it just does. Again, I'm sure I don't really need to talk about these weapons too much, because these are up there in the Elden Ring folklore with things like the Rivers of Blood and obviously Blasphemous Blade, but to make this build work, here are the stats and talismans and everything. So again, a high amount of intelligence, but we're using the Shard of Alexander along with the Ritual Sword Talisman, Magic Scorpion Charm, and Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman just to basically negate the Magic Scorpion Charm, 60 intelligence, enough dexterity and strength to wield the weapons that I've mentioned, whilst using the Intelligence Knot tier and the Magic Shroud and Crack tier to again just boost basically all the damage we're doing with these weapons. Again, I didn't really use too many spells, but with the intelligence tier in the Wonder Physic, you can also make use of Rani's Dark Moon again. So if you want to basically use that at the start of the fight to negate your enemy's magic resistance and deal even more damage, feel free to do that. I think I maybe actually did that once or twice, but everything that we're doing is also going to be freezing our enemies, and obviously when that happens, they'll take even more damage from our attacks, and that's why these weapons are just so brutal. Like I said, if you basically wanted an intelligence version of the Holy Knight that we talked about earlier that is versatile and that basically allows you to use everything, Iceman is your build. But of course, there is one last build that I want to talk about, and you guys can probably hazard a guess what weapon it's going to include. So for our last build in this video, we have got ourselves the Blood Flame Samurai. Again, a really cool samurai build that I personally make around the Eleonora's Pole Blade, but all the stats and everything I'm going to show you in a moment does also perfectly fit the Rivers of Blood if you want to use that. But as I say, realistically, you want to be using Eleonora's Pole Blade because it's just miles better and so much more stylish. It's an insane pole blade with an insane Ash of War that not only gives you hyper armor, but also has a unique moveset, kind of like the moves from the Bloody Finesse build earlier, where you will launch yourself forward into your enemies before then moving back out whilst attacking them. So using this at the right time, you can actually dodge some attacks whilst dealing damage to your enemies, and this attack also does a high amount of poise damage, and the weapon is of course Blood Flame, which means it does come with innate bleed buildup. It's also got unique charged heavy attacks which can be useful in certain scenarios and again deal quite a substantial amount of stance damage, but realistically with a pole blade it's all about DPS, as you're going to be doing multiple hits in very quick succession. So again, I'm not going to bore you too much. Here are the stats and everything that you need, and again, it's a DPS build. I'm sorry, that's 4 times in this video, I know, I'm fully aware. But with this one, we are delving a little bit more into Arcane, because then we can boost that bleed damage that I was speaking about. But again, it's a pretty standard run-of-the-mill DPS build using all of the same talismans, as well as the Dex Knot tier and the Thorny Crack tier. And well, I've talked about this weapon far too much on this channel, and the reason being is just because it's so damn good. It's so stylish. In fact, I love the weapon so much that I even worked with Project Orochi to make some really cool shirts around it. But not just that, we've also got some really cool Dragon Man designs, along with some other cool designs too, and we've got them in both shirts and hoodies. And if you guys are looking for some really cool designed pieces of clothing, feel free to check out the link in the description. It'll be at the very top. It'll take you over to my personal page with Project Orochi. I've been collaborating with them for the best part of like 6 months now, creating these designs for you guys, so it's not just like your regular YouTube merch. Like, it's actually some really well thought out and cool designs that will put you in an exclusive club of like, hey, is that shirt Jazzers, like, I recognize that, like, yeah, is that his? But only real legends of the channel will know that. So if you want to get something, feel free to head on over there. And I do also have my unique code now, which will get you 10% off. So definitely make sure that you use the code Jazzer if you do head on over there and get something for yourself. But after that really cool segue to an ad read, I know, I'm sorry. I do just want to say a huge thank you to everybody that has watched this video all the way through and is currently listening to my voice. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I've been away for a little bit and I'm sorry. I was supposed to really only take like 2 or 3 weeks off over Christmas and New Year's just to recharge my batteries, but I can't lie, I kind of extended that break a little bit more. Although I have still been live streaming, I've just been maybe a little bit lackluster on the videos, and I'm sorry, but we're back now. Hooray! We should be bringing out even more videos for you guys whilst I'm also streaming. So if you want to stick around for all of that and you're new around here, be sure to subscribe. Obviously, we're on the road to 50,000 subscribers. Maybe we can make that happen this year. But other than that, I hope you guys enjoy these builds. Obviously, let me know how you get on. If you do use any of these builds in this video, be sure to drop a like rating on your way out. And again, thank you so much for watching this video, but I guess I will catch you in the next one of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.